the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. This is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. I'm joining you from the low desert, but Dr. Mark Flesher is joining me from my old stomping grounds. Although he's in a different part of Atlanta than I was. But uh, Mark, thank you for joining.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Um, it's late spring, early summer in Atlanta. How's the humidity?
Uh, 100%, pretty close to it today. Yeah, we are definitely dripping wet when you walk outside. So
That was,
I'm jealous of the desert.
I don't know. I mean, it's going to be about 110 degrees here pretty soon. Not
Oh,
today, but pretty soon. So
yeah, I think I'll pass. I think I'm good here.
yeah, it's you don't need a new shirt when you walk outside, but you better be wearing shoes here. That's
Oh,
the
absolutely. I'm sure.
um well, anyway, Mark, thank you very, very much for joining us today. Um, You are a historical consultant, a historical research consultant, and
Mhm.
you have worked on some really interesting projects. And I was wondering if we could begin by just sort of talking a little bit about what you do, and maybe going back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about, your background as a historian and how that led you to your current career.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, as we talked about a little bit before, it's very strange as to how far information has come along with graduate studies in recent years. It really didn't exist when I started graduate school in '06. Um, you basically were going to school for one reason if you were going to get an advanced degree, which was essentially to teach. That's initially what I wanted to do. It was either between that or I wanted to write books. I love the research. And so I thought that if the teaching thing wasn't something that I ultimately wanted, that I would probably either gravitate toward an archives and become a specialist in archives and then publish due to the knowing the specialty of the documents in the house. I look to a person like Dr. Jim Cusick at the University of Florida, for example. Um, he tends to write on stuff that's within his archive, and so I thought that was really attractive for a university press. But I knew that I wanted the mastery and the skill set, and I think that is the important point that takes me to now. As I started looking at the degree as less than just being a quote and a historian, but what does the skill set allow me to do? And that was something I had to embrace because I'm sure you've probably run into this and with other people too. It's you ask your professors, hey, if I don't want to teach, what do I do? At least back when I graduated in 2013, there was a lot of blank stares and suggestions maybe to go to the career placement office that also was pretty much a dead end. And so the necessity is the mother of invention. And clearly, that's what I had to do. If you look at my resume, I did some wild stuff that I shouldn't have technically been able to do if you were to just look at the narrowness of the degree. But I went into things like finance, writing behavioral finance, and researching and writing for a financial advisory firm with no financial background. But I think that when you have an advanced degree, and if you look at it from a skill set standpoint, it means that you can do the work. Um, and I think I told your student friend or your colleague when we were talking recently that when we met in Georgetown, we were talking about jobs and narrowness of titles and so forth. And so I approached my degree in terms of a skill set that I could use that would apply broadly. And I think that when you have the advanced degree like that, I told your colleague, and I still believe this is true, that anything that they ask of you after in the quote real world is so much easier than the graduate process. It's just extraordinarily difficult. And I talked about that there are people that talk about going to graduate school when they're typically working on their bachelor's or something. And they say, "Oh, I want to go get a PhD," when they haven't even gotten a master's. And the thing I like to point out is life happens and things change. The economy can change, the skill set, what the job titles can change. And so I ended up realizing that if I didn't want to teach, that it was going to require a much more broad view of the job market and what I could see myself doing. And so I use those skills now broadly where I can figure it out. And I'm pretty transparent about my ability to research, write, to think, and to synthesize.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is something that actually really bothers me about graduate education, graduate history education, in that I don't think the people who end up becoming your mentors in graduate education, and this is not a shot at my mentors were wonderful and I love them, but
Mhm.
they don't know the world outside of the ivory tower.
That's correct.
Right, and so they're actually the most poorly placed people to give you career advice for anything outside of the ivory tower, and
Absolutely.
they come up with notions like, "Well, maybe you can teach in high school," and it's like, "Well, yeah, but
Yeah,
if I don't wanna teach in college, why would I wanna teach in high school? That's worse."
absolutely.
Or, "Oh, well, maybe you can go work for the government," and it's like, "Well, maybe, but maybe I don't wanna do that either." That comes with its own, that comes with its own, you know, nothing wrong with a government career, but maybe somebody doesn't wanna do that. And so, the moment that you choose to do a PhD, to some degree, the joke is you're self-selecting obsolescence, but you're, you don't realize that there's not gonna be very many people along the way that can give you really good, strong career advice because either they never needed it or they just don't know. And it's not a shot at them. You don't know what you don't know. And whereas what you're talking about is actually something that I think is really important. It's being entrepreneurial about yourself. Taking your skill set, how do I leverage this? What are other opportunities? Be creative, you know, and throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and you never know what might stick. And I mean, you talked about working in a financial advisory firm. I actually worked in reverse. I began as a financial advisor and ended as a historian.
Ah,
So I spent 10 years in the financial advisory world.
I
Um,
see.
yeah. So, I have a slightly different perspective on that. But the one thing that working in the private sector first perspective it really gave me was that like a lot of the skills that we have with advanced liberal arts degrees are perfectly transferable to the private sector. We just don't know what they are and we don't know how to market ourselves.
That's true, and there's also, I was speaking to your colleague recently, and part of the problem that's changed an awful lot, particularly with the job market, and what makes it very, very difficult to find a job. Again, this could be considered a knock, but I don't mean it as such, is that because of the nature of headhunting for the recruiters, many of them don't possess any kind of education at all, and so a lot of times they will look at your job title, and if you don't have that exact job title, then they will not waste their time trying to submit you.
Right.
And it's compounded by the fact that many of them now are not in this country and don't even understand a basic sense of geography. For example, me being in Atlanta, I've gotten job offers for Anchorage, Alaska, at 2 days on site. Would that work for me? For a 3 month gig? And you try to explain to somebody who's not in this country that like, hey, this is a really really far away and there's just isn't a lot of concept. And what I took from that is that the job process now is made all the more difficult, the more education you have as well, because it's frankly, the PhD is a costly degree. It's costly for even the firm that I was at, for example, the financial firm. It costs a lot of money to have somebody who's gonna quote do research and write, particularly in some of these smaller firms where they don't have the extra money to
Mhm.
to to pay you. And so it becomes a real problem if you were looking for a literal fit based on a job title and you have a non-traditional career, then you're required to, in order to eat, in order to put a roof over your head and pay those lovely student loans that Sally Mae contacts you about, you have to figure out something else. And so the necessity of changing to the skills came about when I was trying to explain over and over and over it again to people who didn't even understand the concept really of graduate school as to how and why these skills could benefit them and how I could do the work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's this notion in the private sector, and it's not based on nothing. I mean, it's based on a little bit of experience, or but that if you're somebody with an advanced degree, let's say in history too, which is a little harder to explain to people. I mean, and people know what history is,
Sure.
right? So you don't have to explain what the discipline is necessarily, although people have some interesting notions about it. But you don't have to fully explain it, but to explain why you got a truly advanced degree and like what that actually means, it's a big jump for people. You got to be sympathetic to people. They don't know, right? Why would they know? Um, but so when they think of an academic, they sort of, I think, have in their heads like the characters from the Big Bang Theory TV show,
True.
right? Who are a little awkward socially, have
Yep.
very narrow interests, and are probably not going to be a great fit on your team, right?
Absolutely. And I've seen this in a number of avenues. For example, I was invited back as part of the University System of Georgia's push in order to do educational consulting. So they brought me in to talk to the students, the graduate students, the would-be graduate students. And in fact, some of the more interesting conversations happened with the faculty before and after the meetings. There was an awful lot of, well, what do they think about academics in the quote real world? And then I saw the same thing in the quote real world of like, what do those academics think about people like us? And
Right.
I maintain that there's this huge amount of fiction going on, that there are two very different, almost like alien subcultures existing. One is the quote real world, and then academia is quote not the real world. And
Mhm.
I found that to be a big lie.
Yeah, I think you're completely correct. And for anybody who's an aspiring academic and is listening to this podcast, I think what we're getting at here is one of the best ways you can know what people think about academics outside of academia is to talk to people outside of academia on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I would
And
say that the the idea that there are these two different worlds, I find to be one of those interesting things because, especially nowadays, what I've seen in the, I guess it's 13 years now that I've been graduated, doesn't seem like it, um, is the erosion of the reputation of academia and the academic, the vitriol, particularly against quote, historians or people with advanced degrees. The idea that you have a PhD, you're a blowhard, these kind of anti-intellectual times that we live in. I found really, really, it's a difficult conversation when you are not in the academic space to have that designation or to have somebody find out that you have that designation. There's an awful lot of assumptions
Mhm.
about it, and I find that to be part of what keeps academia in sort of a silo. The idea, and again, I'm going to get maybe a little controversial here, but the notion that quote it's not about the money when it comes to teaching is something I strongly disagree with, and I think it's partly responsible for pitting academia against the real world. The idea that no, 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 those people out in the real world, they're chasing money, things that don't matter. And I've heard this a lot from inside the academic quarter. So for us, it's not about the money. Well, why not? Because you're not going to get it in academia. And I find that every time I'm offered a job that has anything to do with some type of academic type, I know that the salary is going to be 30 or $40,000 less than some kind of comparable skill set in like corporate or big tech or something thereof.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the ways that I think we comfort ourselves as academics in with getting an advanced degree and then working for significantly lower money is that, well, it's not about the money, right? We have to comfort ourselves with something, and I think this is why on why you know I think some academics comfort themselves with political activism,
I
and
I could see that, yeah.
yeah. Where they think like, "Okay, well, no, this is part of a broader project. This is part of a, so I can take I can take less money in order to do that." Um, and you're right that, like, we kind of comfort ourselves in it, but it's because I think, again, coming back to your original point, I don't think we understand what our skill set is. And because we don't understand what our skill set is, why the heck should non-academics understand what our skill set is?
And to piggyback on a recruiter, again, who has a really tough time understanding. For example, when I started, I got a job in big tech, and I did two different stints on two different, very different sides of Verizon headquarters. For example, I was a writer and editor the first time on the domestic side, or the normal people's cell phones, not a business, is what they would say. And then I did a second stint a couple of years later on the business side, working as an analyst, a systems analyst. Again, these are all very different positions. And what you ended up figuring out really quickly was that things were very easy, no matter what you did, because I do think that when you go to graduate school and you're built that way, the type of personality you have is such not to sit idly by, but you want to figure things out. I still obsessively read and research, and I'm working on all these different projects now, and I can never get enough of the information. There isn't anything that I don't want to know. And so when you go into something like, tech, or the real world, if you want to use that terminology, you can stand out pretty quickly. Particularly, like, I worked in government, I worked at the National Archives, I worked at the state level as an archivist for the New York State Department of Health, and almost immediately you become separated even by your behavior and your curiosity, and that certainly sets you apart. And what you end up figuring out pretty much by the end of the week, if not the second week, is that almost every skill that you possess is something that's valuable to the job market, except for in academia, where that's all part of the table stakes. Like, everything is thrown in there, and you get this one small little sum. And then when you translate out, if you're able to transition out, you'll end up figuring out very, very quickly that they'll pay you about double.
Right.
And I immediately doubled my salary when I went to Verizon from finishing the PhD.
Yeah. All right. Uh, we are. This is fantastic because, I mean, I just can't tell you how much. I didn't realize that this is where we were going to go in the conversation, but you're speaking to things that I really believe, and I try to, not only instill in people who are getting an undergraduate liberal arts degree that there's things that they're going to learn in here that are incredibly transferable to the private sector. You just don't know what they are because nobody's ever told you what they are. And then and that's even more so, and that includes graduate work, as well. But, how did you end up jumping to Verizon?
I ended up jumping to Verizon sort of at a last desperate measure when I was doing some consulting work for an engineering firm, actually out of Chattanooga. I was researching all these licensing and that type of stuff, and I got a random headhunter call, and it was from somebody who was really unique as a recruiter, who was able to look between the lines and say, "This person is a unique person, not only on paper, but I have a feeling there's more to this person's story." And so she called me, and we had this discussion, and the discussion very quickly said, "Listen, this is an interesting job that has been it's been unfulfilled for almost a year and a half. The person who held this position before was a writer at the New York Times, the Washington Post, a bunch of big sort of positions, but it requires it requires flexibility, the understanding that the person giving the assignments may not even understand exactly what they're looking for, but the ability for you to be a self-starter, to sit down, to be able to look between the lines and figure out, okay, well, this is good, but you also have a number of other points you can go to here. And so it required that empathy and the human touch, particularly something from the humanities, not something so rigid of maybe say like a technical writer, where it's fairly simple. It's very straightforward in terms of clarity, almost writing like a robot, writing instruction manuals. That's not what this job was. It required asking a lot of questions, researching, being able to synthesize a lot of disparate information into something usable. But it also had to be grammatically correct. It had to be legally correct. And you had to go through a review process also with the attorneys at a place like Verizon headquarters in order to make sure the details were legally correct as well. So it required a lot of finesse, the ability to jump on calls, get in person with somebody. That also is a skill set that is being lost as well. There's an awful lot of people that do not want to speak in person to somebody. They prefer to text and or email. And so when you put all these things together, you're a person who is able to work independently without oversight, but work with people when you need to as well, and be able to be part of that team without resorting to saying something like, "Well, I'm a PhD. I think I know better." And there's an awful lot of that. My boss actually told me the time that he was more surprised that I didn't come in with the baggage of a PhD and insist on people calling me that, which I don't. I'm actually, because I transitioned out of academia, I've heard it so few times that it sounds weird to me to be called doctor. Um, but that was a surprising thing, is the assumption again of this. If you look at this divide between the quote real world, or the job market, and academia, there's an awful lot of misunderstanding
Right.
on both sides. So his assumption was I was going to come in and try to run the show, which I'm sure happens an awful lot.
Yeah. Well, it's learning those those social skills of how to be a team player. And and that might be something that as academics we don't do, especially as historians. I mean, we don't collaboration isn't really part of the discipline. And I think maybe to some degree to our detriment. But it's because again, learning how to collaborate, learning how to work on a team, learning how to shove your own pride sometimes is that's one of those really important soft skills which is necessary in the private sector. It's necessary in any
You know,
job.
absolutely, and that's something that I learned along the way, because I was always very curious. I had gone back to school. I tried. I was in New York State, and I was trying to pay for things on my own, and I was getting nowhere fast. I found friends kind of moving on, getting ready to graduate, that type of stuff. And I was working an awful lot of jobs, and I knew that I really liked the history thing. But it actually took a professor to believe in me and said, "Well, when you go to graduate school," and I thought, well, that's interesting. I never even thought about that. But I was writing 100-page papers as an undergrad just for the experience. And so what I would do is I was so hard headed at times where I would read something, we discuss it in class, and I'd say, "This doesn't strike me as what the author intended. I know what I'll do. I'm going to reach out to the author."
Hmm.
So as an undergrad, I started writing professors.
Wow.
I'd write to Gordon Wood. I'd write to Bernard Balin. I'd wrote Peter Wood at Duke at the time, Laurent Dubois at Michigan State, now at Duke, about Haiti. And I had all these questions. And I never, there was only one person who never wrote me back. It was Jack Green.
Hmm.
In all the years, there was only one person who didn't respond. But what that enabled me to do was not be afraid to talk to people, even people who I held in high esteem. And so what I was doing early on was collaborating. And I had questions, lots of questions. And then that spiraled into working on textbooks. I did textbook work for big people like Palgrave Macmillan and St. Bedford St. Martin's and stuff like that. So we'd work on these collaborative type things, and it would require an awful lot of finesse, phone calls, emails, drafts, editing, all that kind of stuff. So I didn't think it was unusual, even when I finished graduate school, to go into something that was not just sitting in a silo, which when you're going through it, as you know, with the PhD, there's some lonely times sitting walled away from people. I don't like that anymore. Which was what I told your colleague of, are you that type of person who can be antisocial, maybe not by choice, but because of the necessity of the degree? It's kind of a lonely thing, and it's certainly not anything I could repeat at this point. Um, but working with people in a number of venues, whether it's talking to them at conferences, not being shy, talking to archivists, asking, you'd be surprised what you can get when you start asking.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I saw a lot of my colleagues, and even going to conferences. The weirdest thing of all was getting all these emails from Ivy League people asking me questions about, like, what do I think is a good topic and stuff. I'm like, that's the easiest thing. You have all the resources and the people in house. Coming up with the idea is the easiest thing of all. And I just ended up figuring out that if you believed in yourself and you had to sort of go wherever the money or where the opportunities were, you had to have enough self awareness to say, like, I can figure this out. I'm the type of person that can figure this out and do what needs to be done. Because there is no roadmap. It's certainly, I don't know if it's any clearer now,
Yeah. Well,
but
I
I
mean,
know that when I finish.
yeah. Well, you're writing your own roadmap, and I mean, I think this is, and you've written your own roadmap, and I think this is something again that as academics we don't, you know, when you decide to pursue a PhD in history, which I think the average amount of time it takes to complete a PhD in history is 7.2 years in the United States or something
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
Which I mean, you realize like it sounds like a lot of time, but there's a couple of years of coursework, and then you got to do the comprehensive exams, and then you have to write like
Hmm.
a book length project based on primary sources. That's going to take a long time. Um,
Yes.
and you're, but like you, a lot of people go to graduate school. I mean, even like I, who was late going to graduate school, I didn't begin my PhD till I was 32. Um, but I changed a lot between 32 and when I graduated at 38. Like so
Absolutely.
right? And so, my entire 30s were wrapped up in that, which maybe isn't a particularly productive way to spend your 30s, but c'est la vie. Um, the but my point is that whatever notion I had going into it at 32, I had a different notion at 38. And if let's say you're 24 going into a PhD program, which is probably a little bit more normal, meaning you don't have any private sector experience, your only experience is being in school. You're going in at 24 with some reason in your head why you're going to do it, but you're going to be a totally different person at 30 when you leave, or 31 when you leave. And so the idea that you should still just like commit yourself to the same thing that you thought at 24 just because you have that degree now, it almost feels like inertia. You're just committing to
Absolutely.
inertia.
Absolutely. I'm also mindful of, one of the things I explain during the consulting things when talking about history and my feelings of not going straight into a PhD. The master's is very different, obviously,
Mhm.
but I still think that the old days of the professors getting their PhDs at like 24 or 25 kind of thing, there is so much material now that
Yeah.
you don't have enough time at 24. If you give it 10 years, there is not a person who's gotten their PhD under 30 that you couldn't run circles around. And I'm not trying to be coy or trying to, be egotistical. It's the amount of work that I've done. I did 18 hours a day and I didn't miss it for almost 13 years. I read everything under the sun. I was completely antisocial, completely glued to trying to outpace the competitor that I saw in the mirror. And I was just obsessive about trying to master all this material because the world history degree is about 4 times the amount of work. Not only is it 2 or 3 languages, but it's also you have the world component and then you have 3 other sections. So I have an entire US history within one of my fields. And the only reason you can do that, and the only way that you can do that is by time. And you don't have enough experience also when you're 24 and you've never been sick before. You've never struggled. Nobody's passed away. And you're trying to especially do something like biography, for example. You don't even have the concept to figure out how somebody's going to navigate their life if you've gone from undergrad straight into graduate school with no real world experience of anything.
Yeah, I mean, and there's another you make a really one of our jobs as historians is, imagined sympathy. We have to have an imagined sympathy with our subjects or and then one of the great things that somebody who is a biographer can provide the world is readers can get an imagined sympathy for the character, whether they're good or bad or or otherwise. And for me, my whole worldview changed, and it sounds so dumb, but I've got 2 kids, and, I grew emotionally and mentally exponentially the moment they were born. How do you know I'm not saying you can't do that without kids, but you need life experience in order to be able to have any real concept of the human experience.
It's true. And also, while I don't have children, I've got the fur child and everything. I was in a car accident that's probably the thing that's most responsible for altering the trajectory. This is something that I like to talk to students who are going to go into graduate school to say that, are your circumstances now the ones that you anticipate not changing all throughout graduate school? Meaning nobody's going to get sick. You're not going to have some kind of car accident that's going to cause an awful lot of hospital bills, an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of expense. That happened to me my 3rd year of the PhD, and I was getting ready to graduate the following year, and I lost an entire year because of a car accident
Mm,
that I didn't know how I was going to be able to stand up and teach. And so, with the bills that came in, the reason I think that it's worth mentioning here is this life is happening. When you're in graduate school, there is a part of an awful lot of us, not everyone, but there's an awful lot of us that gravitated toward this silo of graduate school as a way to maybe control our circumstances, get some kind of level of control of, um, maybe the thoughts in our head. I have a colleague who just couldn't sit still. And so the graduate school experience was almost therapeutic for him. But for somebody like me, the mastery and the challenge and being occupied with something that I regarded as a noble effort, fueled me for an awful lot of years. And then you can see on my productivity, it was like I hit a wall, and there was an awful lot of second guessing my choices. And I ultimately did finish, but I was wrapped with all kinds of wraps and ice and all kinds of stuff to write 20 hours a day. And that is also the reality of something like graduate school is you could have planned for all this time and life happens. Now what? And
yeah,
so I had to pivot,
yeah,
and pivot to what? I did not know.
yeah. Okay, well, I mean, I think, again, we can clearly talk about this all day, Mark. I think this is useful
Yeah.
advice and a useful discussion for people to listen to. But I want to hear about, your historical consulting with television and movies. So, can you talk a little bit about what you've gone from Verizon, you've done some work with engineering firms, you've done some work
Mhm,
with some financial advisory, and now
mhm.
you're working on project development for TV and movies. So, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit, beyond the NDAs type stuff is that it's a really cutthroat world, and it's something that doesn't work the way that you would think it would. For example, even like scripts, when you get involved with things like scripts where you read it over, they say, "Hey, here's a script, right? We want to introduce some more characters." You'll look through these scripts and so forth, and they're not written with any kind of grammatic. accuracy. They're really formulaic, and you approach it from an academic standpoint in the sense of like, okay, what do I need in order to flesh out these character details here? And there is an awful lot of surrendering, I guess is what you could say, whether because you want to come in and stay factual.
Hmm.
And a lot of these scripts, depending on the kind of project, there was a famous project that I was involved with where they wanted to use Haiti instead of Puerto Rico. They wanted to film it in Puerto Rico, for example. They ignored every suggestion that I had. And that is just par for the course. Sometimes you all you can do is supply the information, plead your case, and understand that there's so many politics that pretty much what I end up doing is understanding that I am going to be some kind of backdoor information suggester, kind of thing, where that information ends up getting taken by the producer and or the writer during their pitch, and they may not use anything. And so you never really know exactly what these people are looking for. And that's part of the assignment too. Part of your assignment is to take a position and then make somebody leap off the page. And some of these historical characters you find are kind of revolting at times, and then you try to take a definitive position in order to make them jump off the page more. There's, even in your research techniques, not only just looking at census records, sometimes it's going back generations to figure out the culture they came from. For
Hmm.
example, there was a project that involved a senator in Tennessee who was voting for suffrage. And there was very little written about his background and that of his mother. His mother played an important part, influential role in his life. And so I went back, and part of it is debunking the myths, but also understanding that the myth usually wins out at the end of the day. But that's part of my academic background, is to say like, hey, here is the myth component, here is the reality. Although I understand the myth reads better, or certainly is a more compelling story. And so sometimes there is this give and take where you feel the need to tell the truth, but understand that sometimes very little of what you supply actually may be used. And that's okay. What it took me a minute to understand that that was the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of why they pay you, right? Is it's not just for the information, but to sort of realize, okay, at the end of the day, this is a job. And
It is.
and if you weren't being paid, then you would have to care a lot more about how much of their information you take.
That's true. And also, what I found in recent years, and it came on like a firestorm, is the AI component.
Hmm.
I would get questions like, well, what would be the value of hiring you versus just trying to do research using AI? And you kind of laugh, but you would also be able to explain, hey, why don't you run an AI research component here? We can go through it quickly, and I can tell you how quickly this thing has erred. And 10 times out of 10, it's wrong.
Yeah.
So it really requires somebody with a subject mastery, and also the confidence also to be able to find the answer and the correct answer, to be able to even override something like Chat GPT or OpenAI, whatever it is. And I think that's also a learned skill that comes with part of the confidence that you get from having completed such a rigorous course of study.
Yeah.
And there just isn't a substitute for the experience.
Well, no kidding, there isn't. And I mean, I mean, I can admit that, I mean, although I don't use AI to generate, like, I use it occasionally, and I use it as a tool, but I'll be honest, I don't know how with an advanced degree you can do sophisticated, like, without an advanced degree, you can do sophisticated research with AI, because I wouldn't know how would you know the prompt to enter to even get
Well, that's true.
remotely
And
correct information?
I used it this past weekend actually, because I'm working on this other project so that I know backwards and forwards. There was this unique little component, and I realized AI kept trying to tell me something based on previous prompts of trying to create this fabricated role that involved this individual that was only actually like a really tiny role. And I'm arguing with it, and it backed down immediately to say like, well, I don't actually have any evidence, but I was reading based on prior prompts that you had asked something involving this individual. It had to do with my dissertation subject, this guy out of Florida, and he was featured as this like one line part in this court case. And Chat GPT, OpenAI, whatever it was, Gemini tried to give him this central role.
Right.
And so what I ended up finding when I was working with it and combating it, it just made my arguments that much stronger because I knew the material backwards and forward. And so sometimes I use it just as another set of eyes,
Oh yeah.
also understanding that I'm going to argue with it and be the boss of it at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, I was using it to for a different podcast that I do. I we were doing an episode on Charles Beard, and
Hmm.
I was trying to find like late 19th century economic determinists that were building to Stiegelman kind of thing. Anyway,
Hmm.
and but without being able to ask the question like what are some non-Marxist economic determinists who influenced the role of Eli and Seligman, like the work of Eli, like how, and AI can maybe be able to find that, but like how would you even begin to prompt that unless you have some, you have a knowledge around the subject, right?
That's absolutely true. So I use it as a tool, and anytime I've been asked about the AI thing, and particularly when it comes to research, and then fielding those questions as like, what is your value add here? I'm absolutely able to explain and articulate that I use it as another set of eyes. It's
Yeah.
simply like a fail-safe measure. I'm going to do the work, but sometimes I'm able to use it to synthesize points quickly, and just say, look, do you want the 3 point? Do you want the elevator pitch? Because you have to be able to do that in the same way. And again, this is a direct translation of your elevator pitch for your dissertation.
Yeah.
How quickly do you want the 2 hour version, the 1 hour, the 30 minute, the 15, the 5, or the 30-second one? And then being able to do that is a real skill as well. And it enabled me to almost from the first week being at a place like Verizon or any of the other places I worked at, you go on and you're on a conference call. They end up speaking to the CEO of the company or the VP of Verizon, for example, and they're marveling at how a new employee is talking. I'm like, this is nothing to me.
Right.
I don't mean it to sound egotistical. It's like when you stand up in front of several hundred people or more, whether it's in an academic conference or even in the day to day of your classroom, do you think talking on the phone to some person who you can't even see, would be extraordinarily difficult? And the answer is just it's not.
No. Yeah, I have to teach a class, and afterwards they're gonna put information on Rate My Professor. I obviously
That's well,
this is nowhere near as this is nowhere
yeah.
near as frightening as that.
Yeah, yeah, the teenagers and early 20 somethings are terrifying, yeah,
Yeah.
especially with their Rate Your Professor.
Yeah.
I think I'm still rated as a history machine on Rate Your Professor.
Oh,
I had a
okay.
former boss tell me that.
I've never looked mine up. I'm too afraid to. But
Well, I mean,
others can look it up for me and tell me what's
yeah,
on there. Um,
absolutely.
but anyway, so when you're working on a film or TV project, a lot of what you're doing is you're taking, you'll get a script, and so one of the things they're looking to do is to maybe uh, either flesh out some of the characters they currently have, or to find additional characters that would fit in with the story.
That's absolutely true, and so I can't speak directly because of an NDA, and part of this is like, it's so cutthroat, right? That
Sure.
sometimes these people have to the difference between, like, when you start something, when they submit it, when you actually hear back can be a huge amount of time, particularly, when we've seen the political winds change. You've seen it's not been a great time for TV and film. And my wife is a producer, big time producer, and it's been really dicey the last few years. And so a lot of funding gets pulled. So with something like this, where I say it's not all glamorous, it's much like any other contract kind of job. It's feast or famine, right? And so I am at the moment on a downturn for a couple weeks until I'll start something else. But there was an awful lot of time of history related type themes. There was a proposed movie on Kate Warren. She was the first female Pinkerton detective. That went nowhere, but it was an awful lot of research and scripts kind of bouncing back and forth, fleshing stuff out. That went nowhere, and that was 3 or 4 years ago.
Hmm.
And a part of it is the winds that change,
Hmm.
and so things just aren't as profitable anymore. And so if it's not some kind of murder, detective, gangster type thing, the history stuff a lot of times ends up being the victim of the times, the economic downturns, the political winds, and so forth. And so the last project I was in, it was a number of characters for a proposed series, for example, and there was an awful lot of room for, hey, are there any interesting people that you've encountered? And I said, absolutely. There are, in fact, two of these people I would argue are just not even really all that relevant to your story and could be subsumed under, one or even two episodes rather than making them four or five separate. In fact, what I think you should do is add, X, Y, and Z. And that happens an awful lot also because you are coming in with a totally different skill set. And you have to understand too that these writers or screenwriters aren't, I would argue, they're not actually writers. They're more like half baked idea people
Hmm.
that use a formula in the sense of there's a famous book years ago by a guy named Robert McKee, and it's his book on story. That's a famous one, and he breaks it down in terms of it's a formula. Like all these stories are formulas. So basically, the idea is that there's going to be these shifts, these up and down, up and down. The point of the story is that the character is fundamentally different at the end of the story than they are at the beginning. And so when you understand those principles of story, you could wed that to your historical narrative writing as well, and then be able to help them formulate more solid ideas. And so sometimes it's not actually, how when you've written articles or books, you think like this sentence right here, this is going to be the thing that they quote. This is my most quotable moment type thing. And then I've seen this with my own work where it's the stuff that I, not necessarily a throwaway, but I wasn't, it came out more like stream of consciousness that ends up being the thing that people gravitate to. It's the same thing here.
Hmm.
So, for example, I was working on a project that was supposed to be about 1930s Mississippi. And so all the research that was asked of me involved like Oscar Johnson and these big cotton people, particularly Mississippi's 1930. What was sharecropping like? What are the census records? What was the average life for somebody on a plantation versus a farm versus like being in the city?
Hmm.
And I know from your work, this is right up your alley. Now,
Just say you bring up Oscar
there,
Johnson and without an introduction, I'm like, well, I'm about one of 10 people in the world that might be you could do that with.
oh well, very true. And your work is fascinating, but that's the kind of stuff like it had your dissertation been out at the time, I would have gone to that and been able to pull stuff. But I had done an awful lot of work for a movie that ended up not being about that at all. And the project got shut down, which is typically what happens more times than not. And
Right.
you have to be able to say, like, I had a good run with this. This was maybe 3 months of work or a month or 6 weeks, whatever it is, right? But then be able to funnel that away or put that away and say like, oh, I can use that for talking in the future. um, and so it's kind of one of those things where I think as historians, we get like, for example, there's this project that's near and dear to me, and what I like about doing this kind of work for historical research consultation work is it almost allows somebody to be obsessive about something and sort of master it as much as you can within a certain time frame, and then move on to something else that you could, be obsessive about. And I think it's a great quality if you understand how your brain works and understand the kind of personality you have. It's sort of the best of both worlds. You get paid for something you love to do anyway. You get to learn a whole bunch. And then it's not something that you have to then, write about for the rest of your life necessarily.
Yeah, right. That's fan and that's great. I mean, one of the things that you said there that really should hit home, I think, to any historian is, stuff doesn't go anywhere. You spend a lot of time on something, and you just, for whatever reason, you think there's a there at the start of it, and then for whatever reason, either because there's only so many hours in the day, or other people aren't interested, or whatever, you just have to kind of move on or integrate it into something else and be okay with that. I mean, I think we all as
I think that's
historians have that experience. Like, you think you've got I call it on my laptop, my unborn children file,
yeah.
you
I
know,
think we all have, something similar. Yeah.
right? And, it's you're dealing, from what you're explaining to me, you're dealing in the same thing, except it's just on, bigger scale, or maybe, with more people involved.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at of everything that I've experienced throughout my graduate journey to now is that you have to you almost have to convince yourself at times that you're not crazy, that the world has sort of gone crazy and it's gone very specialized, right? And I do think that initially when you come out and you have something like the PhD next to your name, right? And you're looking to apply to these different jobs and everything. Say if you're thinking about it from inside academia and say, like, well, I don't have any experience dealing with anything with scripts or finance or whatever it is. This is my lane. I'm going to stay into. You have to understand that there's no cavalry coming to rescue you.
Mhm,
That it's your job fundamentally to explain to other people your value and to explain whatever it is they need in order for them to make a decision on your job. I was angry, when I graduated, at giving up so much time and then health with the accident. And I thought that the PhD was enough. Where if I was to put that down in an application, well, obviously I can do the job. I can do this, and your job is this is a walk in the park. And I realized that it didn't really mean an awful lot to most people. And so I had to figure out a better way to explain it. And I think I explained it also in terms of the little things, coming in, being personable, looking people in the eye, the standard sort of stuff that you don't really hear an awful lot about in academia. And so, like, now I'm able to be in rooms with people. And then, even as part of my wife's job, I'm in the exclusive rooms and stuff. And I don't get flummoxed because I feel like I belong there because of what I've done and my ability to prove it over and over again in whatever field that I've gone to. Again, not that it was some sort of master plan, but it, had to eat. And I knew that I could do the job at hand. And so even something like, the script thing, it when you break it down, there is history, there is research, there is writing. There's so much familiar there that if you let these job titles get in the way, they're artificial. They change all the time. And
mhm.
so that's why we always need resume writers, just because the lingo changes all the time. But I focus on the skill set. And I still focus on that. And that's what I lead with when I explain the value. And so when I'm doing the historical research now, I feel like I'm on very solid ground. But the one caveat is understanding again that you're suggesting. It's almost like going to a national park where I'm writing this book on this National Park Service site, and there is a narrative there that they like a lot of myth. The myth sells, and so sometimes when you're dealing with these historical characters, there's a lot of unpleasant aspects to them, even in these rosier stories that they want to tell, and it requires a lot of surrendering to be able to understand that what you want to focus on may not be what the screenwriter or what they're looking for at like the movie studio, what they want. And so somewhere in there, you need to be able to pivot and change your message and almost like becoming your own personal AI thing. I had somebody call me something like that, my own personal like Google prompt, because it had to do with the Mississippi Project, for example.
Mm.
And so they were able to ask me all kinds of questions, not related, not like right in a row, but be able to recall really obscure kind of things and be able to answer as a subject matter expert, and then be able to change the dynamics or the tone of the conversation where you say something based on your expertise, and that gives the screenwriter or the producer a prompt of, oh, didn't even think about that, didn't even know about that, where'd you get
Yeah.
that? All
Yeah.
valuable skills.
Right. All you talk about, a thing that just popped into my head. What this would have been before your career, so I mean, I feel like we can probably talk about it safely. But one of my favorite all-time television characters in a historical show was in Deadwood, Al Swearingen. And like the Al Swearingen, the historical figure, was a lot of the things that they show in the show, but he was also truly a monster in the
Mm,
way that the show doesn't necessarily present him. However, if you're trying to explain the story and the plot, like the story that they were trying to show with Deadwood, which was, social develop like what happens in this environment when all of a sudden the government shows up and there's economic development opportunity and the
mm,
politics around that. And there was a character they needed. And if you were to ask an expert on the town of who was that guy, it was Al Swearingen.
mm,
It was the pimp brothel owner who did all of that stuff at the time. And so you're kind of, I can imagine the historical consultants trying to present, create this character. The guy's truly a monster, an amoral monster. But he also fills this really important, like, role to play in the screenplay. And so I can imagine the tension that would exist between the screenwriters who want this, like, character because they've got a role they need filled, and the historical consultants who's like, "Well, yeah, but he was also a cold-blooded murderer."
yeah, that's the kind of, if anything's going to keep me up at night, usually when I am submitting any of this research type stuff, it's that stuff. It's knowing sometimes, like, you lived in Atlanta, in the land of Gone with the Wind,
Yeah.
what people like, and I do comparative systems of slavery. You talk about trying to navigate a minefield,
Mhm.
but the myth almost always wins because there are people and there are times and there are value systems, cultures that are so unpleasant when we look at it, in the rear view mirror, that sometimes it's really, really difficult to figure out how you're going to paint it, warts and all, and still have them be compelling characters. And I absolutely understand where you're coming from, although I have not seen Deadwood. But I deal with this an awful lot of how do you explain to modernity a certain set of values that were considered, run of the mill, or somebody being, enlightened. We deal with this all the time with the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the founders. And so of trying to explain to posterity why these people matter, although they're slaveholders or have, some really unpleasant
Right.
things. And therein lies the rub of, I think that's why historians will always get paid for some of this stuff, is because it requires a lot of explanation.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to in the, the case that I brought up of Deadwood, just it he is all like the character was all of those things, but the show was not about his personal morality, it was about the politics of the town. And so what matters to that story is him as this political leader, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And as historians, we have to make that, you brought up Oscar Johnston in my own work.
Mhm.
Oscar Johnston's a complicated guy.
Mhm.
And sometimes there's stuff that I want to talk about that I leave on the cutting room floor because it's really not that relevant to the overall story I'm trying to tell. I'm not writing a biography of Oscar Johnston, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
And so you have to make those decisions because it's, and I am, you do that, and we do that when we're talking about virtually any prominent historical figure.
Very true, very true. And I think that given how you have to explain things, especially in like, with the projects I've been doing lately, dumbing it down is not necessarily like what I like to think of it as. It's simplifying things in a way where you can hint that there is more, but
Hmm.
you write it in such a way that you let them know that you know more about this,
Hmm.
but for the sake of simplifying it for the sake of a narrative or a pitch. And that's also important too, to understand like what you're actually doing. The idea of giving somebody else the information, it's going to be written and presented in a way that you're not writing a formal, definitive, like thesis type paper or journal article or something like that. You are giving them information in order to then for them to be able to use it. And
Right.
so I think it helps everybody if they understand that you know more about the subject, but you're not willing to derail what they need to do. And it's all about being useful to
Right.
the screenwriter and the producer
Well,
as
one of the,
well. So
yeah, one of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago is that, you said, oh, well, here's this character, and you think maybe they might be then you need 4 episodes on this person, but you come back and you go, you know what, maybe one or two. All of a sudden, you just save them money. So now they're, that's good too, right?
you would think, yeah. I mean, it's sometimes it just confuses me as to why certain things get initially greenlit because as the historian, you'd be like, well, that doesn't really sound all that compelling. Like, I don't know who would watch this exactly.
Right.
And then sometimes those projects take care of themselves really quickly because it goes nowhere.
Right.
Yeah, you find out within a couple weeks that nobody was interested in that.
Right.
But sometimes that there's they have most of an idea, and that's where you come in. You're sort of a jack of all trades or a Jill of all trades, however you want to say it.
Right.
But it's also understanding that the job, and this has been true throughout my entire career, is sometimes the jobs form around you based on the type of person you are, your
Sure.
capabilities and your skill set. And so when I was talking to people about wanting to go and do a PhD or any kind of graduate work, is that given the skill set, your command and everything, sometimes you'll walk into a job where they anticipated you doing, X role, which was a very narrow and defined role. And suddenly your capabilities, because you have an awful lot of skills that you don't even, and I want to step back just to say that part of the problem is when you come out of academia, you were so brainwashed, and I hate to say it that way, that your skills just aren't worth anything, is you don't even know how many skills that you actually have.
Yeah.
And so you'll walk into this role. And I remember this first job that I had with the financial place gave me this assignment that he thought was going to take me like 2 weeks. And I came back and I found something literally within like a half an hour that answered everything that he needed and was put in such a succinct way that he went, whoa, I didn't even know that anybody necessarily like knew this like this. And so even like going into big tech or whatever it is, you'll find that your skill sets can really set you apart really quickly. And so they may create a job, and this has been the case pretty much from the get-go, is they create a position that's basically tailor-made to your skill set
Right.
that can be different from the one that you were hired for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Mark, thank you very, very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. It's been great chatting with you, and hopefully, best of luck. I know you've got some research of your, for your history projects, research projects going along too. So best of luck, and looking forward to hearing how that goes.
Thanks so much, Rob. I appreciate it.